The August heat pressed down on Atlanta like a physical weight. Sarah Collins could feel the sweat gathering at the small of her back as she stepped out of the patrol vehicle, the afternoon sun reflecting off the glass facade of the Atlanta Public Library Central in blinding sheets of white light. The temperature gauge on the dashboard had read 103 degrees, and the humidity made it feel like walking through warm soup. Max jumped down beside her, his tongue already lolling, but his ears were up and alert as always. 7 years of partnership had taught Sarah to read every micro-expression on his face, every twitch of muscle, every shift in posture. Right now, Max was content but watchful, his dark eyes scanning the plaza in front of the library with the professional assessment of a seasoned officer. The library rose before them in modernist splendor, all sharp angles and towering windows that caught the afternoon glare. A few patrons moved through the revolving doors, seeking refuge from the oppressive heat in the climate-controlled sanctuary within. Sarah adjusted her utility belt and gave Max the hand signal to heel as they approached the entrance. This was supposed to be a routine community relations visit, a chance for library staff to meet the K-9 unit and for Sarah to drop off some educational materials about police services. The original plan had included a presentation for a summer reading group, but the event had been cancelled at the last minute due to low registration. Now it was just a courtesy call, a chance to maintain good relations with the community partners who often provided valuable information during investigations. The cool air hit Sarah like a wave as she pushed through the doors, the temperature differential so stark it raised goosebumps on her forearms. Max shook himself once, his tactical harness jingling softly, and fell into step beside her. The library's main floor stretched out before them in organized rows of shelving units, study carrels tucked into corners, and a central circulation desk where 2 staff members were processing a small queue of patrons. Sarah spotted Margaret Chen behind the counter, the head librarian who had coordinated their visit. Margaret was a compact woman in her 50s, with silver-streaked hair and reading glasses perpetually perched on her nose. She raised a hand in greeting and gestured for Sarah to approach once she finished with her current patron. The library hummed with the quiet industry of a summer afternoon. A few researchers hunched over laptops at the study tables, their faces bathed in the blue glow of their screens. An elderly man sat in one of the reading chairs near the periodicals section, a newspaper spread across his lap. The air smelled of old paper and carpet cleaner and the faint metallic tang of the air conditioning system working overtime against the Georgia heat. Max walked beside Sarah with his characteristic silent grace, his nails clicking softly on the polished floor. His head swiveled as they moved, cataloguing scents and sights with the methodical precision that made him one of the most decorated dogs in the Atlanta PD K-9 unit. Sarah had learned to trust those instincts implicitly over their years together. Max had saved her life twice, found evidence that broke cases wide open, and tracked suspects through terrain that would have defeated any human tracker. But today was supposed to be easy. Today was supposed to be paperwork and pleasantries. They were halfway to the circulation desk when Max stopped. Sarah felt the leash go taut and looked down. Max stood rigid, every muscle in his body locked. His ears were pricked forward, his nostrils flaring as he drew in deep breaths of air. His tail, usually relaxed when off duty, had gone stiff and horizontal. Sarah had seen this posture countless times. It was the same stance Max took when he detected narcotics or explosives or the specific chemical signature of decomposition. But they were in a library. There was nothing here that should trigger that response. Sarah knelt beside her partner, keeping her voice low and calm. Max did not look at her. His gaze was fixed on the circulation desk, specifically on a grey plastic bin that sat on the counter near the book return slot. The bin was half full of recently returned items, their spines facing upward in a jumble of colours and titles. Margaret Chen had noticed their approach and was making her way around the counter, a welcoming smile on her face. Sarah held up a hand to pause her, then turned her attention back to Max. His breathing had changed, becoming shallow and rapid. A soft whine escaped his throat, pitched so low that only Sarah could hear it. In 7 years, she had never heard Max make that sound outside of an active crime scene. Something was wrong. Sarah rose slowly, her hand moving to rest on the grip of her service weapon. She did not draw it, not yet, but the familiar weight was reassuring against her palm. The library continued its quiet business around them, oblivious to the tension that had suddenly crystallized in the air. Margaret reached them with a puzzled expression. "Lieutenant Collins, is everything all right? Is Max okay?" Sarah kept her voice steady. "Margaret, I need you to step back from the circulation desk. Do it casually, like nothing is wrong." The librarian's eyes widened behind her glasses, but she had the presence of mind not to make a scene. She took a step backward, her hands coming up slightly in an unconscious gesture of compliance. "What is it? What's happening? Max is alerting on something." Sarah nodded toward the bin of returned books. "Those items, the ones in that bin. When were they returned?" Margaret glanced at the bin, her brow furrowing. "Those came through the exterior drop slot. We empty it every few hours. That batch would have been returned sometime this morning, before we opened. We don't have cameras on the drop slot itself, just the general exterior." Sarah nodded, processing this information. She reached for her radio and keyed it on. "Dispatch. This is Lieutenant Collins, badge 7742. I'm at the Atlanta Public Library Central main branch. I have a K-9 alert on unknown materials. Requesting backup and a forensics team. No immediate threat visible, but treat as precautionary." The radio crackled back an acknowledgement. Sarah turned to Margaret. "I need you to evacuate the immediate area around the circulation desk. Do it quietly. Tell people there's a minor maintenance issue. Can you do that?" Margaret nodded, her face pale but composed. She moved off to speak with her staff, her voice carrying the practiced calm of someone used to managing difficult patrons and unexpected situations. Sarah returned her attention to Max. His posture had not changed. He remained locked on the bin, his focus absolute. She reached out and ran her hand along his flank, feeling the tension in his muscles. "Easy, boy, show me." She gave him the command to indicate, and Max moved forward with slow, deliberate steps. He approached the bin and raised his nose to its edge, inhaling deeply. Then his paw came up and touched the side of the bin, the classic indication that he had found something. But he did not stop there. He circled to the other side of the counter and indicated again, this time on a single book that had been set aside, apparently waiting to be reshelved. Sarah examined the book from a distance. It was a thick hardcover, its dust jacket showing a photograph of a mountain landscape. The title was something about hiking trails in the southern Appalachians. It looked perfectly ordinary, the kind of book that would circulate regularly in a public library. But Max did not make mistakes. She pulled on a pair of nitrile gloves from her belt pouch and approached the book carefully. The pages were slightly warped, as if the book had been exposed to moisture at some point. She lifted the cover, and a brown envelope slid out from between the pages, landing on the counter with a soft thump. Max barked once, sharp and urgent. Sarah froze. The envelope was standard business size, unmarked, sealed with clear tape, but there was something else. Along one edge, barely visible against the manila paper, were smudges of reddish-brown, the color of dried blood. She stepped back from the counter and keyed her radio again. "Dispatch. Upgrade my request. I have a possible biohazard at the scene. Unknown substance, appears to be blood. I need that forensics team expedited. And get me a detective. The next 30 minutes passed in controlled chaos. Uniformed officers arrived to establish a perimeter, gently herding the library's few patrons toward the exits, with apologies about a gas leak that required precautionary evacuation. The forensics team came with their cases of equipment, setting up a processing station near the circulation desk. Sarah briefed them on Max's alert and the discovery of the envelope, then stepped back to let them work. Detective Marcus Webb arrived just as the forensics team was photographing the envelope. Webb was a veteran investigator, 20 years on the force, with a face that looked like it had been carved from weathered oak and eyes that missed nothing. He nodded to Sarah and surveyed the scene with professional detachment. "Your dog found this?" he asked. Max alerted on the return bin first, then on this specific book. The envelope was inside. Webb pulled on his own gloves and leaned in to examine the envelope without touching it. "Has anyone opened it yet?" "Waiting for you." Webb nodded. He signaled to one of the forensics technicians, who carefully slit the envelope open with a scalpel. The contents spilled out onto the sterile sheet they had laid on the counter. Photographs, half a dozen of them, printed on standard photo paper. They showed a man in various settings, walking down a street, getting into a car, sitting at an outdoor cafe. The man was middle-aged, with thinning hair and a slight paunch, dressed in the unremarkable clothes of someone who wanted to blend into a crowd. In several of the photos, his face had been circled in red marker. There were documents too, photocopies by the look of them, their edges slightly skewed from imperfect positioning on a scanner. Sarah could see what looked like financial records, columns of numbers and dates and account identifiers. There was also a single sheet of paper with a list of coordinates, GPS locations written in precise numerical notation. And there was more blood. Dried brown droplets spattered across several of the photographs, as if someone had handled them with wounded hands. Webb picked up one of the photographs with tweezers, studying the face of the circled man. "I know this guy. Or I knew him. Robert Callahan, federal informant. He disappeared about 3 years ago, right in the middle of a major corruption investigation. The FBI was using him to build a case against some city officials. Then he just vanished. No body, no evidence of foul play, nothing. The case went cold. Sarah felt a chill despite the warmth of the library. And now someone is mailing his photograph to the public library. Not mailing. Webb set the photograph down carefully, returning it. In a book, anonymously. The question is why? And why now, after 3 years? The forensics team worked through the afternoon and into the evening. They processed the book, the envelope, and every item in the return bin. They dusted for fingerprints and collected DNA samples from the bloodstains. They photographed everything from multiple angles and catalogued each piece of evidence with meticulous care. Sarah stayed at the scene, unwilling to leave until she understood what they were dealing with. Max had been given water and a chance to rest in the air-conditioned patrol vehicle, but he remained alert, watching the proceedings through the window with keen interest. He knew something significant had happened. He could sense it in the tension of the humans around him, in the careful way they moved and spoke. By 8 o'clock, the forensics team had a preliminary report. The blood was human, type O negative. There were partial fingerprints on several of the documents, but they were smudged and might not be usable for identification. The coordinates on the paper corresponded to locations throughout Atlanta and its suburbs, though their significance was not immediately clear. The photographs were at least 2 years old, based on the development date printed on their edges. Webb had been running background on Robert Callahan and shared his findings with Sarah as they stood outside the library in the cooling evening air. Callahan was a mid-level accountant who had stumbled onto irregularities in the books of a construction company with city contracts. He had taken his concerns to the FBI, and they had recruited him as an informant. For 18 months, he had gathered evidence of kickbacks, bid rigging, and embezzlement involving city officials and private contractors. The investigation had been building toward indictments when Callahan disappeared. The official theory was that he had gotten spooked and run. Webb flipped through his notes. Some people thought he had been turned, that the targets of the investigation had bought him off and he had fled with their money. But there was never any proof either way. The case fell apart without him. No indictments, no prosecutions. Everyone involved walked away clean. Sarah absorbed this, her mind working through the implications, and now someone is dropping evidence connected to his case in the public library. Evidence with blood on it. Webb nodded grimly. Either Callahan is alive and trying to expose something, or someone who knows what happened to him is finally talking. Either way, this just became a lot more complicated than a mysterious book return. Sarah looked through the glass doors at the circulation desk where Max had first alerted. Her dog had sensed something wrong before anyone else, before there was any visible indication that the ordinary afternoon held anything sinister. That instinct had launched them into something that felt much larger than a single envelope of old photographs. "I want to be on this case," she said. Max found it. "We should see it through." Webb studied her for a moment, then nodded. "I'll talk to the captain. But this touches on federal territory. The FBI might want to take over." Sarah shook her head. "Callahan was their informant and they lost him. 3 years and they have nothing. Let them observe if they want. But this is our case until someone proves otherwise." Webb almost smiled. "I'll make the call." The next morning brought new developments. The crime lab had confirmed that the blood on the documents matched samples taken from Robert Callahan before his disappearance, part of a standard medical screening conducted when he first agreed to cooperate with federal investigators. The blood was his, which meant that at some point he had been bleeding while handling these documents. Whether that was 3 years ago or 3 days ago, they could not yet determine. Sarah arrived at the precinct early, Max at her side. The case had been assigned to her unit in cooperation with Detective Webb, and she had been given a small team to work the investigation. She set up a conference room as their base of operations, covering one wall with maps and photographs and timelines. Max settled into his customary spot beneath the table, his head resting on his paws, but his ears tracking every conversation. The coordinates from the envelope became their first focus. There were 7 locations listed, spread across the city. Sarah divided them among her team, sending officers to check each site and report back. The first 3 turned up nothing unusual: a vacant lot, a strip mall parking garage, and a residential street in a quiet suburb. But the 4th location changed everything. Officer Patricia Delgado called in from an industrial area near the rail yards. "Lieutenant, you need to see this. I'm at the 4th set of coordinates. It's an abandoned warehouse, been empty for years, according to the neighbors, but there are signs of recent activity. Fresh tire tracks, some litter that doesn't look weathered. And there's something else. Someone painted numbers on the back wall. They look like dates." Sarah was in her car within minutes, Max riding shotgun with his head near the open window, ears flattened by the wind. The warehouse district was a tangle of rusted fences and crumbling buildings, relics of an industrial era that had long since moved on. Delgado's patrol car was parked outside a brick structure with boarded windows and a sagging roof. The interior was dim and dusty, shafts of light cutting through gaps in the boards to illuminate a floor covered in debris. But the back wall was clean, swept free of dust and rubble, and on that wall in red spray paint someone had written a series of dates: 09/14/2021, 11/03/2021, 02/18/2022, 5/29/2022, 4 dates spanning 8 months, ending more than 2 years ago. Sarah photographed them and sent the images to Webb, who was coordinating with the FBI liaison. Meanwhile, she let Max work the scene. He moved through the warehouse with purpose, his nose to the ground, processing the layered history of scents, that had accumulated in the abandoned space. Near the painted wall, Max alerted again. He pawed at a section of concrete floor that looked subtly different from its surroundings, newer perhaps, or poured at a different time. Sarah felt her stomach tighten as she knelt to examine it. "We need ground-penetrating radar out here," she said into her radio, "and a team ready to dig." The radar results came back within hours. There was an anomaly beneath the concrete. A void space roughly 6 feet long and 3 feet wide. The shape was unmistakable. Someone had buried something human-sized beneath the warehouse floor. The excavation took the rest of the day. As the concrete was broken up and the soil beneath removed, Sarah stood watch with Max at her side. The dog was tense, his body vibrating with suppressed energy. He knew what was down there. He had smelled it through inches of concrete and years of decomposition. They found Robert Callahan at a depth of 4 feet. What remained of him, anyway? The body had been wrapped in plastic sheeting and buried with lime in an attempt to accelerate decay. But the Georgia clay had preserved enough for identification. Dental records would later confirm what the forensic team already suspected. 3 years after his disappearance, the federal informant had finally been found, and someone had made sure of it by dropping an envelope in the Atlanta Public Library. The discovery of Callahan's body transformed the investigation. What had begun as a mysterious book return was now a murder case, one with potential connections to corruption, federal investigations, and powerful people who'd thought themselves untouchable. Sarah found herself at the center of a storm of activity, coordinating between her own department, the FBI, and the district attorney's office. Webb became her primary partner on the case. The detective had a methodical mind and a network of contacts throughout the city that proved invaluable as they began to trace the threads of the conspiracy that had cost Callahan his life. The dates painted on the warehouse wall corresponded to meetings that Callahan had documented in his files, meetings between city officials and representatives of construction companies that had been awarded lucrative contracts. The FBI provided access to Callahan's original informant files, heavily redacted but still useful. Sarah spent hours poring over the documents, building a picture of what the accountant had uncovered before his death. The corruption had been systematic and far-reaching, involving bid rigging on city contracts worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Callahan had been compiling evidence against a network of officials, contractors, and fixers who had turned Atlanta's infrastructure projects into a personal piggy bank. But the files also revealed something troubling. Callahan had been paranoid in the months before his disappearance, convinced that someone within law enforcement was feeding information to the targets of his investigation. He had documented his concerns in encrypted notes, hints and suspicions that pointed toward a leak at a high level. The FBI had dismissed his fears as the natural anxiety of an informant in over his head. Now, in light of his murder, those concerns took on new weight. Someone had known about Callahan. Someone had known where he lived, what he was doing, who he was talking to, and that someone had arranged for him to disappear before he could bring down the entire corrupt enterprise. Max remained Sarah's constant companion through the investigation, his instincts proving valuable in unexpected ways. When they interviewed former colleagues of Callahan, Max's reactions provided subtle cues about their truthfulness. He grew agitated around those who were hiding something, calm around those who seemed genuinely cooperative. It was not evidence that would hold up in court, but it helped Sarah focus her attention where it mattered. 10 days after the discovery at the library, a second envelope appeared. This time, it was found in a book returned to a branch library in Buckhead, tucked inside a volume on local history. The librarian who discovered it had heard about the first incident and called the police immediately. Sarah and Max were on site within the hour. The envelope contained more photographs, more documents, more coordinates, and more blood, the same type as before. matching Robert Callahan's sample. But these photographs were different. They showed not Callahan himself, but other people. Men in suits shaking hands, exchanging envelopes, meeting in parking lots and private clubs. Sarah recognized one of the faces from news coverage. It was Marcus Tillman, the city councilman who chaired the committee overseeing infrastructure contracts. The coordinates led to a storage unit on the outskirts of the city, rented under a false name and paid for in cash. Inside, they found boxes of files, thumb drives full of data, and a notebook written in Callahan's cramped handwriting. The notebook was a diary of sorts, documenting his work as an informant in paranoid detail. The final entries, dated just days before his disappearance, described his growing fear that he was being watched, that the people he was investigating had learned of his cooperation with the FBI. Sarah read those entries with a growing sense of unease. Callahan had written about a meeting he was scheduled to attend, a meeting arranged by his FBI handler. He was supposed to wear a wire and record a conversation with one of the key figures in the corruption network, but he had written that something felt wrong, that his handler had been acting strangely, that he was not sure he could trust the people who were supposed to protect him. The entry ended with a single line: "If something happens to me, look at who benefits, not just the obvious ones, the ones in the shadows." Sarah shared the notebook with Webb, and together they began to build a new timeline. The FBI handler who had worked with Callahan was a man named Gregory Pierce, a senior agent with 2 decades of experience. Pierce had retired shortly after Callahan's disappearance, citing burnout from the pressures of the job. He now lived in a gated community outside the city, collecting his pension and playing golf 3 times a week. Webb wanted to approach Pierce carefully, through official channels and with FBI involvement. But Sarah had a different instinct. She wanted to understand who they were dealing with before alerting him to their interest. So she and Max conducted their own surveillance, spending hours parked outside Pierce's neighborhood, observing his routines, his visitors, his patterns. What she saw troubled her. For a retired agent living on a government pension, Gregory Pierce had expensive tastes. His house was worth well over $1 million. He drove a new luxury sedan. He belonged to an exclusive country club with membership fees that would consume a significant portion of his retirement income. Either Pierce had other sources of wealth, or he was living beyond his means. Sarah ran quiet background checks, pulling financial records and property documents. What she found painted a damning picture. Pierce had received a large payment 3 years ago, routed through a series of shell companies that terminated in offshore accounts. The timing corresponded almost exactly with Robert Callahan's disappearance. The retired FBI agent had been bought, and when his informant became a liability, Pierce had likely facilitated his elimination, but proving it would be another matter. The financial trail was deliberately obscured, the paper companies designed to frustrate investigation. And there was still the question of who was returning Callahan's evidence to public libraries, who was guiding the investigation toward these discoveries. Someone wanted the truth to come out, but they were doing it in a way that maintained their own anonymity. Sarah found herself thinking about the method. Why libraries? Why books? There was something almost poetic about it. Hiding secrets in plain sight, among volumes of knowledge waiting to be discovered. It suggested someone who valued information, who understood its power, who believed that the truth should be accessible to anyone willing to look for it. The third envelope appeared 2 weeks later, this time at a library in the East Atlanta neighborhood. The pattern was now established. Unmarked envelope, blood-stained documents, photographs and coordinates leading to more evidence, but this envelope contained something new. Alongside the usual materials was a typed letter, unsigned, addressed to no one in particular. The letter told the story of Robert Callahan's final days. It described how he had been lured to a meeting with promises of protection, how he had been ambushed by men working for the very people he was trying to expose, how his body had been disposed of in a warehouse that one of the corrupt contractors owned through a subsidiary. The letter named names: Gregory Pierce, Marcus Tillman, 3 construction executives and a lawyer who had served as the network's fixer. But the letter also raised questions. It was written with intimate knowledge of events that only a witness could possess. Someone had been there when Callahan died. Someone had watched it happen and done nothing to stop it. And now, years later, that someone was trying to make amends by exposing the crime without exposing themselves. Sarah read the letter 3 times, committing its details to memory. Then she had it analyzed by the crime lab. The paper was standard office stock, available at any supply store. The typing was done on a common inkjet printer, model unknown. There were no fingerprints, no DNA, no identifying marks of any kind. Whoever had written it knew how to avoid leaving evidence. The investigation accelerated. With the letter as a roadmap, Sarah and her team began building cases against the individuals it named. Forensic accountants traced the financial transactions. Surveillance teams documented current activities that suggested ongoing criminal enterprises. The FBI, initially resistant to reopening the Callahan case, became cooperatively engaged as the scope of the corruption became clear. Gregory Pierce was interviewed, formally and on the record. He denied everything, of course, claiming that Callahan had simply disappeared and that his subsequent retirement was unrelated. But his expensive lifestyle and the suspicious payments could not be easily explained. Under pressure, he hired a lawyer and refused further cooperation. Marcus Tillman was more careful. The city councilman had maintained plausible distance from the day-to-day mechanics of the corruption, operating through intermediaries and never putting his name on anything incriminating. But the photographs from the envelopes placed him at meetings he had denied attending with people he had claimed never to have met. His political support began to erode as rumors of the investigation spread through City Hall. Through it all, the envelopes kept coming. Every week or two, another library would report a discovery. Each envelope added new pieces to the puzzle: photographs, documents, coordinates, and occasionally letters that provided narrative context. It was as if someone had assembled a complete prosecutorial file and was releasing it in installments, building the case piece by piece in a way that could not be ignored or suppressed. Sarah became obsessed with identifying the source. Who had access to this information? Who had witnessed Callahan's murder and survived? Who was methodical enough to maintain this campaign of exposure over months without making a single mistake? The answer came from an unexpected direction. One afternoon, as Sarah was reviewing the latest batch of evidence with Webb, her phone rang. The caller ID showed the main number for the Atlanta Public Library system. Margaret Chen was on the line, her voice tense with controlled excitement. "Lieutenant Collins, I think I know who has been returning those envelopes, or at least I know someone who might be able to tell you." Sarah was at the library within the hour, Max padding beside her through the now familiar doors. Margaret met her at the circulation desk and led her to a small office in the back, away from the public areas. "One of my employees came to me this morning," Margaret said. "She has worked here for 5 years, quiet woman, very reliable. She told me that she has been receiving the envelopes by mail and placing them in the book returns according to instructions." Sarah felt her pulse quicken. "Who is she?" "Her name is Eleanor Vance. She is 62 years old, works part-time in our cataloging department, and her maiden name was Eleanor Callahan. Robert Callahan was her younger brother." The interview with Eleanor Vance took place in a quiet room at the precinct, with Sarah asking questions and Webb observing through the one-way glass. Eleanor was a small woman with grey hair and nervous hands, her eyes red from what looked like recent crying. She had waived her right to an attorney, insisting that she wanted to tell her story. 3 years ago, someone started sending me letters, Eleanor said. Anonymous letters, postmarked from different cities, never with a return address. They told me that Robert had been killed, that the FBI had betrayed him, that the people responsible would never face justice unless someone made sure the evidence came to light. Sarah leaned forward. And you believed these letters? Eleanor's hands twisted in her lap. I did not want to at first. I wanted to believe that Robert was alive somewhere, that he had simply run away from a situation that had become too dangerous. But the letters knew things. They knew details about Robert that only someone close to him could know. They knew about a birthmark on his shoulder, about a nickname our mother used to call him, about the last conversation we had before he disappeared. She paused, gathering herself. And they knew how he died. They described it in detail that no one could have invented. The warehouse, the men who took him there, the way they killed him. Reading those letters was like watching my brother die over and over again. Sarah gave her a moment before continuing. And the envelopes with the evidence? They started coming about 6 months ago, always by mail, always with instructions. I was told to place them in specific books and return them to specific libraries at specific times. I was told that this was the only way to ensure that the truth came out, that official channels could not be trusted, that someone inside law enforcement had been responsible for Robert's death. Eleanor looked up, meeting Sarah's eyes directly. I know I should have come to you sooner. I know I broke laws by handling evidence, by participating in this scheme. But I needed to know the truth about my brother, and whoever is sending these letters, they promised that if I followed their instructions, the people who killed Robert would finally face justice. Sarah studied the woman, seeing the grief and the guilt written in every line of her face. You do not know who is sending the letters. Eleanor shook her head. I have tried to figure it out. I have searched for clues in the postmarks, in the writing style, in the details they include. But whoever they are, they know how to stay hidden. All I know is that they were there when Robert died, and they have been living with that secret for 3 years. The revelation of Eleanor's involvement added a new dimension to the investigation. Sarah now had a direct link to the anonymous source, someone who could serve as an intermediary if needed, but Eleanor claimed that communication was one way. She received instructions, but had no way to send messages back. Webb argued for using Eleanor as bait, monitoring her mail and trying to trace the source of the letters. But Sarah had a different instinct. The anonymous figure had been careful for 3 years, releasing information at their own pace, maintaining control of the narrative. If they sensed a trap, they might disappear entirely, taking whatever remaining evidence they possessed with them. Instead, Sarah decided to send a message of her own. She arranged for a carefully worded press release, announcing progress in the Callahan investigation without revealing specific details. She mentioned the cooperation of concerned citizens and the department's commitment to following the evidence wherever it led. And she included a specific phrase, one that Eleanor had mentioned from the anonymous letters: the truth waits to be discovered, like words in an unread book. It was a signal, a message to the anonymous source that their efforts had been received and understood. Sarah did not know if it would work, but it was the best option she could devise. 3 days later, Eleanor Vance received a different kind of letter. This one contained no evidence, no instructions for book returns. Instead, it contained an address and a time, along with a single sentence. Send the lieutenant. She has earned the truth. Sarah knew it could be a trap. The anonymous source had witnessed a murder and possessed evidence that could destroy powerful people. There was no guarantee that their intentions were benign, no assurance that they would not simply eliminate another inconvenient investigator. But Sarah had been chasing shadows for weeks, following a trail of breadcrumbs through libraries and warehouses and shell companies. This was her chance to finally meet the person behind it all. She went alone, as the letter instructed, but not unprotected. Max rode in the back seat of her personal vehicle, his harness equipped with a GPS tracker that would allow backup to find them if needed. She wore a wire, its transmissions monitored by web, and a tactical team positioned 2 blocks away. If things went wrong, help would arrive within minutes. The address led to an apartment building in Midtown, a nondescript tower of glass and concrete housing hundreds of identical units. Sarah parked in the visitor lot and approached the entrance at the designated time, Max walking beside her with his ears pricked forward. The lobby was empty except for a security guard who barely looked up from his phone as they passed. The apartment was on the 14th floor, at the end of a long hallway that smelled of carpet cleaner and someone's dinner. Sarah knocked on the door and waited, her hand resting on her weapon, Max positioned to react to any threat. The door opened to reveal a man in his 40s, with the gaunt look of someone who had not slept well in years. His hair was grey at the temples, his eyes shadowed with exhaustion and something else. Something that might have been fear or might have been relief. He looked at Sarah, then down at Max, and nodded as if confirming something to himself. "Lieutenant Collins, thank you for coming. My name is David Mercer. 3 years ago, I helped kill Robert Callahan, and I have been trying to make amends ever since. The apartment was sparse, furnished with the minimum necessary for survival. A couch, a table, a bed visible through an open door. The walls were bare except for a single photograph, a snapshot of a younger David Mercer, standing with a woman and 2 children, all of them smiling at the camera. David noticed Sarah looking at the photo. "My family, they think I am dead. I arranged for it to look like a car accident about 2 years ago. It was the only way to protect them from the people I used to work for." Sarah remained standing, Max alert at her side. "You said you helped kill Robert Callahan." David sank onto the couch, his hands hanging between his knees. "I was an enforcer for the Tillman network. When they needed problems solved, I was one of the people they called. I did not ask questions, did not want to know the details. I just did what I was told and collected my pay." He looked up, his eyes haunted. Callahan was supposed to be a simple job. We were told he was a thief, that he had stolen money from people who would pay to get it back. We grabbed him outside his apartment, took him to the warehouse, and he trailed off, swallowing hard. I have replayed that night 1,000 times in my mind. The moment I realized that he was not what they said, that he was just a man trying to do the right thing. By then it was too late. There were 5 of us, and none of us had the courage to stop what was happening. Sarah processed this, her mind cataloguing details and implications. "You witnessed the murder and did nothing. Then you walked away and kept quiet for 3 years. What changed?" David was silent for a long moment. "I found out that my daughter was sick, a rare condition, the kind that requires expensive treatments and a lifetime of care. And I realized that the money I had earned, the blood money from all the jobs I had done, could not buy her a future. It could only poison whatever time she had left." He stood and walked to the window, looking out at the city spread below. "I started writing down everything I knew. Names, dates, locations, methods. I gathered evidence from old contacts, people who owed me favors or feared me enough to cooperate, and I began sending it to Eleanor, Robert's sister. I figured she deserved to know what happened to her brother, even if she never learned who I was." "Why the libraries?" Sarah asked. "Why the elaborate method of returning evidence in books?" A ghost of a smile crossed David's face. "Robert loved libraries. He told me once, during those hours in the warehouse before. He said that libraries were the only truly democratic institutions, places where anyone could access knowledge, regardless of wealth or status. It seemed fitting that his truth should be returned to the world through the places he loved." Sarah considered this, weighing David's story against her own instincts. Max had relaxed slightly since they entered the apartment, his posture suggesting that he did not perceive an immediate threat. It was not proof of David's honesty, but it was a data point. "You know that I have to arrest you," she said. "You participated in a murder. Whatever your reasons, whatever you have done since, you cannot walk away from that." David nodded, unsurprised. "I know. I have known since I started this that it would end with me in custody or in the ground. I chose this ending." He reached into his pocket, moving slowly and deliberately. Sarah's hand tightened on her weapon, but David merely produced a flash drive, which he held out to her. "This contains everything. All the evidence I have gathered, all the names and connections, the entire structure of the Tillman network, and everyone who profited from it, including Gregory Pierce, who sold Robert to his killers for $100,000. Sarah took the drive, turning it over in her hands. "And the blood on the documents. Callahan's blood. My blood." David held up his hand, showing a scar across his palm. "I cut myself before handling each envelope. A forensic analyst would compare it to Callahan's sample and find similarities, enough to create a link, without identifying me specifically. I wanted the evidence to carry the weight of authenticity, to feel connected to the crime it documented." It was a calculated manipulation, Sarah realized. David had deliberately created a forensic trail that would enhance the credibility of his anonymous evidence while maintaining his own anonymity. It was the work of someone who understood how investigations operated, who knew which details would compel attention and which would be dismissed. She reached for her radio. "David Mercer, you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder and accessory to the death of Robert Callahan. You have the right to remain silent. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be appointed for you." David listened to the familiar words with something like peace settling over his features. "It took me 3 years to find the courage to do this. 3 years of hiding, of nightmares, of watching my family from a distance because I was too afraid to face what I had done." He held out his hands for the cuffs Sarah produced. "I do not expect forgiveness. I do not deserve it. But maybe, if the evidence holds, the people who gave the orders will finally answer for Robert's death. That is all I have left to hope for." The arrest of David Mercer set off a chain of events that would reshape Atlanta's political landscape. The flash drive he provided contained exactly what he had promised: a comprehensive record of corruption spanning years and implicating dozens of individuals. Forensic accountants verified the financial trails. Prosecutors built cases against city officials, contractors, lawyers, and the former FBI agent who had sold his informant for money. Gregory Pierce was arrested at his country club, pulled away from a round of golf in handcuffs, while his fellow members watched in stunned silence. Marcus Tillman resigned from the city council 1 step ahead of his own indictment, though the resignation did not protect him from prosecution. The construction executives who had profited from rigged contracts found their assets frozen and their freedom curtailed. The trials took months, generating headlines and commentary across the region. David Mercer testified as part of a plea agreement, providing detailed accounts of his activities as an enforcer and his participation in Robert Callahan's murder. His testimony was devastating, corroborated by the documentary evidence and the testimony of other cooperating witnesses who came forward as the prosecutions gained momentum. Sarah attended parts of the trials, watching from the gallery as the people responsible for Callahan's death faced justice. Max was not allowed in the courtroom, of course, but he waited in the car or at the precinct. His presence a constant anchor as Sarah navigated the complex emotions that the case had stirred. She thought often about David Mercer's journey from enforcer to informant, the 3 years he had spent assembling evidence and planning his campaign of exposure. He had done terrible things, had participated in the death of an innocent man, had profited from violence and corruption for years before his conscience finally overcame his fear. And yet, without his efforts, Robert Callahan would have remained lost, his murder unsolved, his killers unpunished. Justice was rarely clean, Sarah had learned. It emerged from compromise and cooperation, from deals made with bad people to catch worse ones. David Mercer would spend the rest of his life in prison, but the people he had helped convict would join him there. The scales were not perfectly balanced, but they were closer to equilibrium than they had been before. Eleanor Vance attended the trials as well, sitting quietly in the back row, watching as the men who had killed her brother were held accountable. She and Sarah had developed an unlikely connection over the course of the investigation. Two women bound by their involvement in a case that had touched them both deeply. Eleanor had broken laws by handling the evidence, but prosecutors had declined to charge her, recognizing that she had been manipulated by forces beyond her understanding. The day Marcus Tillman was convicted, Eleanor approached Sarah outside the courthouse. Her eyes were red, but she was smiling slightly, a fragile expression of relief. "Thank you," she said, "for following the evidence, for trusting your instincts, for giving my brother justice." Sarah shook her head. "Max found the first envelope. I just followed where he led." Eleanor looked down at the dog sitting patiently at Sarah's side. "Then thank you, Max. Robert would have liked you. He always loved dogs." Max's tail wagged once, a simple acknowledgement of words he did not understand, but somehow seemed to appreciate. Life returned to something like normal in the weeks after the trials concluded. Sarah and Max went back to their regular duties, responding to calls, supporting other units, maintaining the daily rhythms of police work that continued regardless of high-profile cases. But the Callahan investigation had changed something fundamental, had reminded Sarah of why she had joined the force in the first place. She thought about it sometimes, during quiet moments in the patrol car or late nights at her desk reviewing paperwork. The corruption they had exposed had been systemic, embedded in the city's institutions like rot in the beams of an old house. It had taken one accountant's courage, one witness's guilt, and one dog's nose to begin the process of excision. How many other secrets were hidden in plain sight, waiting to be discovered by someone paying attention? Max seemed to sense her contemplation, as he always did. He would press his head against her knee, or nudge her hand with his nose, grounding her in the present moment. Their partnership had deepened through the investigation, strengthened by the shared experience of chasing a truth that had seemed always just out of reach. One evening, several months after the final conviction, Sarah stopped by the Atlanta Public Library Central. It had become a habit, a way of closing the circle that had begun there on that sweltering August afternoon. She walked through the familiar doors with Max beside her, nodding to the staff who recognized them now, making her way to the circulation desk where everything had started. Margaret Chen was there, as she often was, sorting through a fresh batch of returned books. She smiled when she saw Sarah and Max approach. "Lieutenant, always nice to see you." She reached under the counter and produced a dog biscuit, which Max accepted with dignified enthusiasm. "We have something for you, actually. It came in last week's donations." She held out a book, a hardcover volume with a dust jacket showing a mountain landscape. Sarah recognized it immediately. It was the same book from which the first envelope had fallen. The hiking guide that had contained Robert Callahan's final message to the world. "Someone donated it back to us," Margaret explained. "No name, just a note saying it belonged here. I thought you might want it." Sarah took the book, feeling its weight in her hands. She opened the cover and found the inside page inscribed with a few lines of handwriting she did not recognize. "For those who seek the truth in unexpected places, for those who follow where instinct leads, for those who remember that justice is a journey, not a destination." And below that, in a different hand, "Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Max. Robert is at peace now. So am I." Sarah closed the book gently. There was no signature, no indication of who had written the words or how they had come to donate the book back to the library, But she understood the message. Somewhere, someone who had been burdened by secrets had finally found release. She looked down at Max, who was watching her with his intelligent dark eyes. His tail swayed gently, his posture relaxed, his ears soft and alert. He did not know the details of what had happened, could not understand the complex web of crime and punishment that had grown from his alert on a warm August day. But he knew that his human was content, and that was enough for him. "Come on, partner," Sarah said. "Let us go home." They walked out of the library together into an evening that was cooling toward autumn, the fierce heat of summer finally beginning to release its grip on the city. The streets of Atlanta stretched before them, full of people going about their lives, unaware of the dramas unfolding around them or the secrets hidden in their midst. Sarah knew there would be other cases, other mysteries, other moments when Max's instincts would alert to something wrong. That was the nature of the work, the endless cycle of crime and response that defined her profession. But for now, walking beside her partner through the gathering dusk, she allowed herself a moment of satisfaction. They had followed a trail of breadcrumbs through libraries and warehouses and courtrooms. They had given voice to a dead man's truth and brought justice to those who had silenced him. They had done what police officers were supposed to do: protect, serve, and pursue the truth no matter where it led. Max looked up at her as they reached the car, his tongue lolling in his signature grin. Sarah scratched behind his ears and opened the door for him to jump in. "Good boy," she said, "very good boy." His tail wagged once in acknowledgement, and then they were moving, heading home through streets that gleamed with the last light of day. The city continued around them, its rhythms unbroken, its secrets intact, but for the few that had been dragged into the light. Somewhere, in libraries and warehouses and back rooms, other truths waited to be discovered, other victims called out for justice. Other mysteries lingered in the spaces between what was known and what was hidden, but those were problems for another day. Tonight, Sarah and Max had earned their rest. The book from the library sat on the passenger seat, its pages holding memories of a case that had changed them both. Sarah glanced at it as she drove, thinking about the inscription inside, the words of gratitude from someone she would never meet. Justice was a journey, the inscription had said. She understood that now. It was not a destination to be reached and then abandoned, but a path to be walked daily with vigilance and courage and the willingness to follow wherever the evidence led. Max shifted in the back seat, settling into his favorite position for the ride home. His eyes drifted closed, but his ears remained alert, always listening, always ready. They were partners, bonded by years of shared work and mutual trust. They would face whatever came next together, as they always had. The car turned onto the highway, merging into the flow of evening traffic. The Atlanta skyline receded in the rearview mirror, its towers glowing against the darkening sky. Another case closed, another truth uncovered, another small victory in the endless battle between justice and impunity. Sarah allowed herself a small smile as she drove. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new puzzles, new opportunities to make a difference. But tonight, she was going home, and that was enough. The miles passed in comfortable silence, human and dog traveling together through a city that never stopped moving. They had done their part, they had followed where instinct led, and in the end, the truth had been discovered, like words in a book waiting to be read. The end of one story was always the beginning of another. Sarah knew this, understood it in her bones. Every case she closed opened questions about the ones that remained unsolved. The victims still waiting for someone to listen, the perpetrators still walking free. But that was the job. That was what she had signed up for when she pinned on the badge and took Max as her partner. You did what you could when you could, and you tried to make sure the scales tipped toward justice more often than not. Max yawned hugely in the back seat, his jaws stretching wide before snapping shut with a satisfied click. He had worked hard today, as he did every day. He had earned his rest. Sarah reached back without looking, her hand finding his head with practiced ease. Max pushed into the touch, accepting the affection as his due. They were almost home now, the familiar streets unspooling beneath the car's wheels. The neighborhood was quiet at this hour, most residents already settled in for the evening. Porch lights glowed against the darkness, beacons of normalcy and peace. Sarah pulled into her driveway and cut the engine. For a moment, she sat in the silence, listening to the tick of cooling metal and the soft sound of Max's breathing. The book from the library caught her eye again. She picked it up, feeling its weight, thinking about all the hands that had touched it, all the secrets it had carried. Then she tucked it under her arm and opened the door. "Come on, Max. Dinner time." The magic words. Max launched himself from the back seat with an enthusiasm that belied his 7 years, landing on the driveway and immediately beginning his inspection of the property. This was his ritual, his way of ensuring that home remained safe in their absence. Sarah watched him work, his nose to the ground, his tail held high. He was beautiful in motion, all coiled energy and focused purpose. When he had completed his circuit and deemed the territory secure, he trotted to the front door and sat, waiting for her to catch up. "Good boy," she said, unlocking the door. "Good boy." They went inside together, into the warmth and comfort of home. The door closed behind them, shutting out the night and all its shadows. Tomorrow would bring new cases, new challenges, new chances to make a difference. But tonight, there was only this: a woman and her dog, safe and whole, resting after a job well done. The book from the library found a place on her bookshelf next to other volumes that held meaning for her. She would keep it there, a reminder of the case that had changed things, of the man who had died seeking truth, and the man who had found redemption by revealing it. Max was already at his bowl, looking back at her with patient expectation. Sarah laughed and went to prepare his dinner, moving through the familiar routines that anchored her days. Outside, the city continued its ceaseless motion. But in this house, for this moment, there was peace. The story of Robert Callahan had found its ending. The truth had been told, the guilty punished, the innocent remembered. And somewhere, in libraries across Atlanta, books waited on their shelves, holding secrets and stories and possibilities that had yet to be discovered. Sarah filled Max's bowl and set it down for him. He dove in with enthusiasm, his tail wagging as he ate. She stood watching him for a moment, this remarkable creature who had been her partner for 7 years. He had found the first clue, had followed his instincts when nothing seemed wrong. He had started a chain of events that had brought down corrupt officials and given a family closure. "Good boy," she said again softly. "Very good boy." Max paused in his eating just long enough to look up at her, his dark eyes warm with understanding. Then he returned to his meal, content in the moment. Sarah went to make her own dinner, moving through her kitchen with the ease of long practice. The evening stretched ahead, quiet and unremarkable, a welcome contrast to the intensity of the past months. She thought about the inscription in the book again. Justice is a journey, not a destination. It was true. She had learned that lesson over years of police work, watching cases unfold and resolve, and sometimes slip away unsolved. You could not win every battle, could not save every victim, could not catch every perpetrator. All you could do was keep walking the path, keep following where evidence and instinct led. Max finished his dinner and came to sit beside her as she prepared her own meal. His presence was a comfort, as it always was, a reminder that she was not alone in the work. They ate together in companionable silence, the only sounds the clink of utensils and the soft hum of the refrigerator. Outside, the night deepened, stars appearing in the sky above the city. When dinner was finished and the dishes cleared away, Sarah settled onto the couch with a book of her own. Max jumped up beside her, curling into his favorite spot against her hip. She rested one hand on his back, feeling the steady rhythm of his breathing. The words on the page blurred as her eyes grew heavy. It had been a long day, one of many long days that had finally led to resolution. Her body was tired, her mind winding down from the constant vigilance that the case had required. Max was already asleep, his paws twitching slightly as he dreamed whatever dreams dogs dream. Sarah smiled and set her book aside. "Good night, partner," she murmured. "Good night." She closed her eyes, letting sleep claim her at last. Outside, the city hummed its eternal song, millions of lives interweaving in patterns too complex to comprehend. Somewhere in that vast tapestry, justice had been served, truth had been spoken, and a voice, silenced 3 years ago, had finally been heard. Sarah slept deeply, dreamlessly, Max warm against her side. Tomorrow would bring new beginnings. Tonight, there was rest. The story was finished, but the work continued. That was how it was, how it had always been, how it would always be. And that was enough.